against them because in the last couple of years they've been expanding into other products, such as Kendo UI, which is a JavaScript framework we're going to talk a little bit about today. Icenium, which is a hybrid mobile app development tool, we're also going to talk about. Other products such as Team Pulse, which is an agile project management tool. Open Access ORM, which is an ORM, obviously. And I had to write them down because I keep forgetting. Oh, there's Sitefinity, which is a CMS tool. And there's Equitech Analytics, which is our new analytics offering. So a lot of stuff going on there outside of .NET. Obviously trying to branch out a bit here. So 30 quick seconds about me. I spent the last 15 years as a web and mobile developer at the University of Wisconsin. About 8 months ago, I was hired at Telerik as a developer advocate, and I either did such a totally awesome or totally terrible job at that 2 months ago I became a product manager. And I still, since I'm a PM now, I still like to get out and talk and write a bit, so that's kind of why I'm here. If you want to find me later, you can find me on Twitter at @RDLauer if you go that way. Otherwise, definitely feel free to email me directly at rob.lauer@telerik.com. And yes, I like to snowboard a little bit. But I have 2 kids, and so I obviously never get out of the house. So today we're talking about mobile. We're talking about how we're going to get an app on a device, right? And so today there's really, sort of 3 different schools of thought. You can go native. We all know native. If I'm going to go iOS, I'm going to be developing with Objective-C, and I'm going to do that in Xcode. Likewise with Android, you're going to write it in Java, and you're going to use an IDE such as Eclipse. And if you're going to go crazy, you're going to round it all off with C# and XAML using Visual Studio to do your Windows Phone development. Now, we all know native is great, right? It gets the best performance. Pedal to the metal, there's nothing between you and the device. You're just going to get that raw speed. You have access to all the native device features. The downside, of course, for native, especially if you're going cross-platform, is it requires the most time and money, right? You need to have that Objective-C and Java experience that is relatively rare these days. Another sort of growing area is the cross-compile service. And these are products from companies such as Xamarin and Titanium, or is it Accelerator? I forget which one's the company and which is the product, but Xamarin is responsible for the open source port of .NET called Mono, and they have a tool that allows you to develop native performing applications with C#. Likewise with Titanium, Titanium is the product. Titanium allows you to write in JavaScript and develop and write native performing code as well. So these services essentially allow you write in these native languages, you write in these languages that are sort of native to you, and it compiles into native bytecode on the devices. Now, cross-compile is great. It gives you access to most device features. You're not going to have full API access, but it's pretty good. Again, great for some developers. If you have that C# or JavaScript experience, there's obvious bonus there. There is a downside to cross-compile because it does require a fair amount of UI work in those tools, especially when I first heard about Titanium, I was like, oh, JavaScript, awesome. That's totally right up my alley. And then I found out that, they have their proprietary markup language. There's no DOM. You actually have to interact with it a different way. But it's still a good tool. Like if you're experienced in those languages, it's still worth looking into. Finally, we have the hybrid model, which is gaining a lot of traction lately. And this is the idea of taking a web-based application. So I'm guessing a lot of you are familiar with this, but it's the idea of taking a web app, so HTML, JavaScript, CSS, wrapping that in a native wrapper, which is usually PhoneGap or Cordova. And for the purposes of today, we're going to call PhoneGap and Cordova the same thing. We're not going to differentiate them. Once it's wrapped in that PhoneGap wrapper, you can install it natively on a variety of devices. Now, with PhoneGap, you have access to some device features. It's definitely not all. There are a bunch of core APIs that come out of the box. You have access to the important ones: geolocation, camera, contacts, file system, all that good stuff. Performance is the huge question mark with hybrid. Since you are developing a web app that is essentially hosted in a web view in a browser on a crappy little device, it's going to have a harder time performing than if it were written in native code. However, its performance is really up to the developer in this case. So on the plus side, you have anybody who's a web developer can be a mobile developer, right? Well, that means if you're a crappy web developer, you're going to be a crappy mobile developer on the hybrid model. But I think hybrid is great for the rest of us. And by the rest of us, I mean those of us, definitely like me, who are either unable or unwilling to learn these native tools. When I was at the University of Wisconsin, I just simply did not have the time or the resources to invest into learning tools that were outside of my wheelhouse, really. Hybrid, for better or worse, it has the lowest barrier to entry. Like I said, any web developer can be a mobile developer using the hybrid model. Now, that being said, there is plenty of hate out there, and I read this quote on Reddit, and I was like, I hear that. I totally hear that, and hybrid is not for everybody. It has its place, though. Even today, you can develop native looking and feeling apps in the hybrid model, but it takes some work. However, I would say that it's always getting better. There are plenty of situations where it does work better than others, such as line of business applications, any apps that don't necessarily require the resources, the hardware resources that are otherwise required of a native app. And I also want to make it clear that I don't feel like hybrid fits everybody's needs, right? It's certainly not one size fits all. If you're a native developer now, keep doing native. If you're doing cross-compile, keep doing that. If you are interested in hybrid, by all means. But one thing I would say too is interesting is we often have some native developers who come to us and say that they're actually using the hybrid model to do prototyping and mockups because it is easy to do cross-platform development. And that all being said, I am living proof that hybrid does work, and it does work today. When I was at the UW, I developed the Badger Game Day app. And this app, the first version, so I did it with Kendo UI Mobile, which we're going to talk about in a second. But to be honest, the first version was kind of crappy. I mean, you could tell, the trained eye, at least everyone in this room, I'm sure, could tell that it was a HTML5 app. Transitions were kind of janky, animations were a little clunky. But a few things happened this last year. I think that really have started to change the game for hybrid apps. First of all, hardware is taking off. We saw the iPhone 5 came out, and likewise on the Android side, Samsung S4. So we're starting to see hardware support that's going to help overcome this performance issue we're seeing. And so we're just kind of starting to see that. The second thing for me was Kendo UI Mobile improved dramatically, and I don't want this to sound like a sales pitch or anything, but I did use Kendo UI Mobile when I was at the UW, so it's appropriate here. But one thing our Kendo UI engineers did last year was to spend a lot of time looking into what are the performance bottlenecks with hybrid mobile apps. And what they found was really interesting was that it wasn't so much JavaScript. Everyone's been all about, well, JavaScript support sucks in web views. And that is true, but they found that it was more with CSS performance. So I'm talking about gradients, unnecessary screen draws, anything that's taxing the hardware unnecessarily was the problem. Once they worked around those in the code, they had a framework that was literally like 2 or 3 times faster top to bottom. So it was an amazing difference when I just plopped that new version in. Oh, the third thing, Android 4.4 KitKat just came out. Now this is huge for PhoneGap developers because it allows for the first time PhoneGap developers can target Chrome as the rendering engine, right? So this means better HTML5 support. More importantly, it means you have access to the V8 JavaScript engine. And yes, I just said that JavaScript doesn't matter as much, but it is significant. So it's a nice thing to see from Google. Finally, one more thing I wanted to mention. For me, really, the number one thing about PhoneGap or hybrid mobile development is how easy it is to develop cross-platform applications. We all know about Windows Phone, and we're all kind of lukewarm on it at best. But the truth is, if you're trying to hit 100% or come close to 100% of market saturation, you need to think about Windows Phone. It's at 4% in the US now and 10% globally. So it's out there. It's something. It clearly has hit 3rd place now, and it's at least worth considering. Now, there's also 4 other pretty big initiatives by other pretty big companies that are focusing on this hybrid model, or, well, more appropriately on the HTML5 model. Google has Chrome OS. Tizen is a mobile OS from Samsung and Intel, I think it is. Firefox OS from Mozilla, and Ubuntu Phone. Now, what's interesting about these 4 is they all look at HTML5 apps as being native apps. There's no shims involved. It's just an HTML5 app runs natively on these devices. So it'll be interesting to see what happens with those. Okay, so what does this all have to do with Kendo UI and Icenium? Well, Kendo UI, as I already said, is a JavaScript framework from Telerik. It is a full UI library, so it's similar to jQuery UI, but even a little bit more expansive. It has the MVVM pattern built in. A lot of you may be familiar with Knockout, and it's got syntax that's somewhat similar to Knockout. It is based on jQuery, so it has a familiar syntax to all of us who've been using jQuery forever. And there are 3 different flavors of it. There's Kendo UI Web, which is for your desktop web development. There's Kendo UI Mobile, which is good for hybrid mobile development, which is what we're going to do today. And it's also good for mobile web, of course. And there's also a Kendo UI Database, which is a HTML5 rich charting and reporting library. Now, Icenium. So Icenium is a cloud-based build service for these hybrid mobile apps. It does use PhoneGap at its core. The way you interact with Icenium is through 3 different IDEs. One is a browser-based client, which I'm going to show today. There's also a Windows client, a native Windows client, and a Visual Studio extension. And we're actually going to talk about the IDE thing at the end, because I know IDEs tend to ruffle people's feathers. So Icenium, just some of the features really quick. It does use Git-based version control out of the box. You can also change some settings to use GitHub or Bitbucket pretty easily, since a lot of us are already using those. There are simulators built in for iOS and Android, and those are insanely helpful for testing and development. There's a couple features. One really important feature as part of Icenium is live sync, and that's the idea of making a change to any of your assets. These could be HTML, JavaScript, or CSS. You make a change and you save that, and you'll instantly see the change on any connected devices or in the simulators. So instead of having to reload and start your app from scratch and tap through, you just make the change and it shows up in whatever view you're on the device. And there's also debugging on device for iOS right now. Remote distribution, there is QR code distribution if you want to send your test builds to testers. So the idea with Icenium is that you can you can develop, you can test, you can compile your binaries, and you can actually publish to the app stores all from within one IDE. So pretty darn cool. All right, so now I'm going to go through a really quick demo of the browser client. And this will be interesting with my tiny resolution here. So I've already logged in. So this is the browser client for Icenium, and the browser client works with any major OS, all the major browsers. Since I'm on a Mac, it's my only choice, unfortunately, right now. Although you could, of course, use any of the Windows clients if you were running Parallels or something like that. So by default, when you open up the client, you have access to your existing projects. So these are all my old projects in here. You can clone a sample project. We have a few pretty big demo applications here that you can take a look at, kind of best practices for using Icenium with Kendo UI Mobile. We also have some sample projects that look at all the core APIs, and now these are some of the APIs I was talking about before, like looking at the camera or the compass. There's all this kind of a lot of samples in there. We also have some advanced APIs where you can look at our analytics package is one. I know Facebook's in here. Barcode scanner, some extra plugins. You can also clone an existing project from any Git-based repository. All you do is throw in the URL to the repository here. For me, though, I'm going to start a new project. And when I do that, I have access to a bunch of different templates. Now, you can certainly start a new project from just a blank template. You also have the option, and I'm not going to talk about this too much, but you can use Icenium Everlive, which is our backend as a service product. And if you're not familiar with what backend as a service means, you might be familiar with parse.com, and this is sort of our answer to parse. It's the idea of taking your database and putting it in the cloud, right? So instead of provisioning a VM, setting up your database server, setting up your tables, writing stored procedures, and then writing an API on top of that, you just set up your tables or your objects in Everlive, and an API, a RESTful API, is automatically created for you. So it's cool. It's worth looking into. jQuery Mobile, of course, a lot of you probably heard of jQuery Mobile. It's another really popular mobile JavaScript framework. We also have Kendo UI Mobile, of course, and Kendo UI Database, which again is that charting library. So let's go ahead and create a Kendo UI Mobile project.
So is Icenium a software as a service platform now?
Yes, exactly, yep.
And that's like subscription? Or
Yep, subscription-based.
Okay.
Yep, so there's a free 30-day trial, and then I can show the pricing at the end. There's a few different options. So it takes a little while to create a project. When the repository, or when the project is first created, it's automatically checked into an internal Telerik Git-based repo. You can certainly configure that to feed off of GitHub or Bitbucket though. And I'm going to have to minimize this stuff, of course. So this is the browser-based IDE. If anybody have used brackets from Adobe, it's kind of in the same vein. It was hard for me, I'll be honest, to initially switch over from using just a standard desktop IDE to a browser. But if your network connection is good, of course you need a decent network connection. It does work really well. And if you've used any modern IDE, which I'm sure most of you have, everything's going to be familiar to you here. We have the ability to add files, add folders. We can import an archive of files. We can run our app in the simulators, and so right now we have a variety of iPhone or iOS and Android simulators. We can create a build from here. Version control, I've already talked about it a couple times, but you'll see the familiar Git-based syntax for all of your version control commands. You can also, like I said, configure a remote repository, so if I want to connect to GitHub or Bitbucket instead, could certainly do that here. And you can publish. If I were done, we have, I don't want to call it one click, but maybe 3 or 4 click publishing to Google Play and App Store. So let me open up some of my project assets here quickly. You'll see when I open these guys up, of course, as should be expected, we have syntax, coloring, highlighting, formatting, everything's nice and pretty. The one thing I'll tell you, the web client does not have auto-completion yet. That is coming in a future version, but the Windows version of Icenium or Windows client does come with that. And so same thing with CSS, of course, coloring, formatting, and our JavaScript. Nothing surprising here, nothing earth-shattering yet. One part of the Icenium IDE that's pretty cool is the designer. Now, if any of you use Visual Studio, I did it for many years. The idea of a designer is kind of hit or miss because I always hated using designers because I hated code generation because it always messes with your stuff. But if you're using Kendo UI Mobile, you can use this Kendo UI Mobile designer, and it allows you to drag and drop a variety of widgets and views and containers and all this kind of stuff onto your app and see a live rendering of that. So it has a little mini version of the simulator in here that you can switch OSs and switch versions. But let's get back to our code view. So before I show you any of the cool stuff, let's take a look at our application really quickly so you can see how Kendo UI Mobile works. Kendo UI Mobile runs off of this idea of that you have separate views or pages of your app. And those are denoted by having a data role property of view right here. So it's just a simple div with a data role of view. Now Kendo UI recognizes that as a single page of your application. So we have our home view, we have a login view that you'll see, which is just an example of a form. We have a location view that's going to allow us to consume some Google Map data. And we have a weather view that just consumes some data stored in the app to show us a 20-day forecast. And this also shows off the templating that's in Kendo UI. So Kendo UI has its own templating engine built in. A lot of you have probably used templating with jQuery or whatever, and so the syntax is pretty similar. Finally, at the bottom here, we have a layout. And this is the idea of, consider it like a master page, or it's a way to give you a consistent header and footer throughout your entire application or parts of your application. So my layout here has a header, so it's again just a div with a data role of header, and my header has a nav bar, a navigation bar in there. Likewise, my footer. My footer, you'll notice, has a div with a data role of tab strip. So this generates a tab strip at the bottom, which is going to allow for me to navigate between my 4 different views. So Kendo UI Mobile is pretty simple to get it up and running pretty quickly. It's fairly easy to see in my markup what's going on here. And let's just pretend that I went through, we created this app. We want to start testing it. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to start running it in the simulator. Now, when I'm in the simulator, it's kind of small, but you can see I'm currently in the iPhone 4 or iPhone 4S, and I'm on iOS 6. And now out of the box, you'll see that my UI conforms to what you're used to seeing with an iOS 6 application. This is not Icenium. This is part of Kendo UI Mobile. One big piece of Kendo UI Mobile is the optional ability to conform to the native guidelines for all of iOS, Android, Windows Phone, and BlackBerry. Now, you certainly don't have to do that, but it's an option there if you want to do that. Likewise, in the simulator here, I can switch over to iOS 7, and it's going to reload my simulator so you can see that everything changed to more conform to the flat UI of iOS 7. Now, a lot of people don't like this. They want consistency across all versions of their application, across platforms. So with a version towards the end of last year, we introduced the flat skin for Kendo UI Mobile, and this provides a consistent interface across all OSs, all versions. So when I hop back over to iOS 6, I can initiate the flat UI, and so you can see that here. Now I'm going to go, well, let's reload this. I'll back to good old iOS 6. So I can navigate through my application. Here's my Google Maps, everything you'd expect to see out of on an app. I've got kinetic scrolling here, which you can kind of see as I'm scrolling. It'll drift a little bit. That's all, again, part of Kendo UI Mobile. One thing that bothers me about this template, though, is that there's no transitions between the views, so it doesn't really feel to me like a native application. Now, instead of using the refresh and reload buttons out here, now I could use the refresh button if I wanted to just refresh the current view I'm on, or I can reload the entire app from scratch if I have to. But instead, I'm going to go back to my code, and this, of course, works a lot better if you have multiple monitors or just a bigger monitor. And I'm going to make a change here. I'm going to say, I'm going to add a default transition. This line of code is where I initialize my Kendo UI mobile application. And I'm going to save it. Now I can go back to my simulator, and now, again, I haven't reloaded anything. But now we have that transition. So that sort of speaks to, that's live sync I was speaking to earlier. It speaks to how easy it is to sort of iterate through changes when you're developing. I would certainly not use a simulator as your final test because it is running within a browser. There's plenty of things that can happen on a device that aren't going to happen in a browser itself. But it is a very useful feature for your development process. You can also, since I'm in Chrome right now, there's nothing stopping me from opening up my developer tools. Which again is going to look kind of weird on this small space, but I can inspect my simulator here just like it were part of any other web page. So I can get to those detailed elements. I can tweak the CSS in here if I want to. I can have access to all of I can look for any network latency issues. Do some JavaScript profiling. I have access to the console here, the ever important console. Those debugging tools are also available in the Visual Studio extension and the native Graphite client, or the native Windows client. Also in the simulator, of course, I can rotate my view to see what things are going to look like when I switch from horizontal to landscape mode. Finally, you can simulate location. You can simulate location if you're doing anything with geolocation. You can simulate network connections. So if you want to if you want to see how your app reacts in an offline state, which is incredibly important for mobile app development, you can do that here. So that's a quick overview of the simulator. You can also, if I plugged in a device right now, I could actually debug directly on an iOS device, which is also cool. You get access to all the again, those Chrome development tools on my device. And since I am developing actually an app that is going to be physically installed on a device, there are the ever-important properties of your project in Icenium. Now, I'm not going to go over these in details just to save some time, but the idea is here for iOS and Android, I can go in. For iOS, for example, I can specify my code signing identity, which for any of you who do iOS development, you'll know what that is. We can set a display name of our application. We can choose which device families it should be able to be installed on, whether or not I need to enable any background mode. Certainly specify the 8 million icons that iOS requires now, and splash screens as well. So we're really trying to take a lot of the pain of the manual grunt work involved with developing an iOS app, take some of that pain away at least. Likewise with Android, I can specify my icons and my 9-patch splash screen. I can also specify a version code and whether or not I want to turn hardware acceleration on. Also with Android, you have the ability to set all of your permissions. For any of you who have done Android development, you know that you have to request permissions of your users for all the crazy things that you can do with their device, and you can do that with just checkboxes here. Plugins. So plugins are incredibly important in the hybrid space. Like I said in the beginning, there are Cordova or PhoneGap does ship with a core set of maybe a dozen plugins. Those are now optional. You can choose to include those or not. You can simply check those on or off. By default, we keep everything. We include everything in an Icenium project, but you can certainly disable anything if you don't need it. And at the bottom here, you'll see a set of integrated plugins. Now, this is going to be a list that's going to grow a lot over the next year. These are plugins that have been vetted by our Icenium engineers and have been proven to work with all of with our product. And there's important ones. I mean, barcode scanner, but push plugin for push notifications is pretty important. SQLite if you're doing any database work and you want to use want to include and utilize a SQLite database with your application, you can do that here. You can also include our Ecotech Analytics package. Now, this is similar to Google Analytics, but in my opinion, actually considerably cooler, and you can include that here. But arguably the most important part of Cordova apps or hybrid mobile apps are the ability to include custom plugins. You can include custom plugins here. It's actually a fairly simple process. You just grab an archive from any Git-based repository and you import it here. I would say your mileage may vary because the quality of custom plugins is really all over the map, but it's here should you need to use that. And what else can I show you? I got to show you the version control quickly. On the app.js file, so that's the JavaScript file that we updated before. You'll now see there's a lightning bolt here. That means that we have a pending commit that we can submit to that includes this file. So I'm just going to pop open my version control and hit commit. And I'll just commit it. And whoops, I need to include some files there. So I did my commit, and now I can look at a history. So what's really nice about this, and this comes in handy more often than you may think, is that you have a built-in diff tool inside of your IDE here. So I can look at the file history of this file. So I can choose these two files. I can run a diff on it. I can see inside my browser here which files changed. You can certainly do a rollback from here if you want. You can also view any conflicts if you have multiple people editing the same repo. You can compare conflicts here and resolve those problems. But that is my really quick overview of the Icenium IDE, at least the web-based version. I don't think there's anything I missed. I have a couple more slides to show you quickly that talks more about the future of where this is all headed. There's Elmo again. So what's next for Icenium? Well, what we heard from